I just want to thank you again for being here today, for being at LongHouse. I love what I hear from all of you, that somebody just said we're filling a need, the programs are good. You know, really the only thing that we've done differently is open more. I got here 4 years ago, and the whole idea is there was one thing we needed to do was to open, just open. And we're open now 5 days a week. 12 months out of the year. We have a beautiful, beautiful light show. Hard to imagine that, you know, in just a few months it'll be snowing and we'll be putting out Christmas lights. But we tried. But it's so much fun. And Debbie's going to continue the program. I just wanted all of you who are so interested in garden and architecture to know that the work of this year that I'm doing with Louis and Debbie and Michael Jones and other trustees is to open the house for public tours. Which seems like a simple thing, like open the door and let people in, but it's a town zoning. So it's a kind of a fussy infrastructure rezoning project. The town of East Hampton is being abundantly good to us, giving us very clear lists of everything we need to do. And none of it is architectural. We're not changing anything. It's two new septic systems, because we have two. We're going to redo the parking lot, which is a kind of a mess, and we need more spaces. We're growing. A boiler, we have to move a deer fence that's in the scenic easement, things like that. And once we match the plan, the survey that they gave us, once you look like this, we'll be able to open, and I'm hoping that will be next spring. And then we're treating LongHouse, and also this fall, thank you. I keep saying I'm gonna have to find like two or 3 weeks and hole up maybe at the East Hampton Library or something, because we've been invited by New York State to be on the National Register of Historic Places. And that's a big long, it's like a thesis paper. Debbie's helping me with that, and Nina Gilman, our recently past board chair, got us off to a good start and wants to remain involved in that process. So that's like writing a thesis paper about LongHouse. And the last thing I'll say, which also is, I think, key to what we're doing here today, it's a little bit of patting on the back. There are places that get on the National Register because they have an important house or an important garden, or someone important was the founder and lived there. And when it was Jeffrey Ivoroni wrote back to us, he said, you tick all 3 boxes. You have the garden and a very important house and an extraordinary founder and owner for a very long time. So it's just so great. And to think of, I always say it's hard to think of this house as historic, especially for some of you who might have, Peter's here, some of you might have had dinner with him, 5 years ago. So historic figure doesn't feel quite right. But I'm an art historian, and that I say my future, 20 years from now, my future self will say, thank you for doing that work in 2025 that made this a historic place for the future. So that's what we're doing. So without further ado, I give you back to Debbie Nevins, who will introduce our next speaker.
No?
Microphone.
I have a microphone.
No, the microphone is recording.
Okay. I'm going to introduce Bill Whitaker, or William Whitaker, who's the director and chief curator of the Architectural Archives at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design. He is the co-author of The Houses of Louis Kahn and Uncrating the Japanese House, Yunzo Yashimura and Antonin and Nome Raymond and George Nakashima. And more recently, he's done 40 exhibitions about architecture. He's trained academically as an architect. And one of the exhibitions was about Ann Ting, who was a very close collaborator of Kahn, as was Harriet Pattison. He's recently involved in the project director for What Minerva Built, an exhibition book project charting the life and work of America's first independent female architect, Minerva Parker Nichols. But I want to make sure you understand she wasn't the first. There was Louise Blanchard Bethune, but she worked with her husband and others, so she wasn't an independent practitioner. So I'm going to give you over to Bill, and he'll be talking about the wonderful work of the landscape architect Harriet Pattison, who was has written the most incredible book called
Our days
Are Like Full Years, which is about her relationship with Kahn, letters between them, and then more historical writing. And it's the most wonderful book. You should all get it. Bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. No, it's a great pleasure to be here, to be in such a wonderful garden space with such a wonderful group of people who are clearly, you're here for a reason. You're energized by this place. And it's always interesting to see how people come together and help places like this endure into the future. So thank you all for doing that and inviting me here today. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects by Harriet Pattison, but I always like to start with the idea of where I'm coming from. And I don't know, that's not my office. But I might be trained as an architect, but I really work as a collections person. I work as an archivist. I work as someone who finds himself in the middle of a school of young people learning architecture, learning landscape architecture, who maybe don't know what they're doing or aren't quite there yet. And they can learn stuff when they come into our collections, and they all do. And when they come in, the kind of stuff that are in those boxes are people at work, are people thinking. These are sketchbooks by the landscape architect Lawrence Halprin. If I were to tell you how his collection wound up in Philadelphia at Penn rather than Berkeley or Harvard, that would be another lecture. But these are amazing drawings, and it's the thing that somebody kept closest to him, sketchbooks, throughout most of his career to navigate the complexity of the world around, and places that he returned to time and again. A particular horse chestnut tree on the Tucker Trail, for example, the movement of water through a landscape. And just so he would go back time and again. And then he would number his notebooks. He would refer to them. He would photocopy them. Frank Gehry got him to blow them up, supersize, and repaint them again. These are resources that are essential to his work in the world. And those sorts of stories about those types of collections, I think, are really important to share with people in the world, especially young students. Those also tell you about places like this and get you close to people who were part of making places like LongHouse and its garden. I happened to get to know people, like Larry Halprin. I had a banana split at California Pizza Kitchen, but also deviled eggs at the Sea Ranch cabin that he and his wife, Anna, lived in and shared a cup of coffee. I'm an archivist, so in a sense, the stories that come to me from these individuals, they're investing in the institution that I'm a part of, in my role of opening up collections, not just for academic use, but also for a broader public dissemination, right? So this is a class I taught with Oriolan last year, and this is just an example of students gathering. It's a drawing course. And I've got sketchbooks from 10 different people, from Larry Halprin to Noemi Raymond to Tony Atkin, a whole range of people. And you put those all together, and you don't really have to talk about who the people are who's doing it so much as you need to give them time to spend with it, to see an infinite variety of ways that you could start to approach questions of how to do things of relevance in the world. So if I distill down what it is that I'm doing with the collections with the students, or maybe why we keep things in the first place, is I think really good designers are wanting to understand how to make something good. But what they really want to do is how to make something really good. And how you even navigate that world involves the tools of design, drawings and models, using your head, collaboration, all those different things. But to stimulate a conversation around that, I think, is a good beginning point. So I always, tell people, because they often have an idea of what an archive is, a dusty place filled with boxes. I think if you go to any archive that's in a design school, you will see the life that's breathed into those materials through this type of engagement. And is that not what a place like LongHouse and what you guys are trying to do here is about? Okay, so Harriet Pattison. She's someone I got to know really well. I would say she was a dear friend. And there's a lot of layers to that, too complex to unpack. But getting to know her really came out of the construction of the Roosevelt Memorial on Roosevelt Island in New York, a design that was initiated in late 1972. It was designed throughout 1973. By early 74, let's say March, they had finalized the schematic designs and they were getting ready to go into construction documents. Then Louis Kahn died. So I'll talk a little bit more about Louis Kahn. You don't know who he is, and I'll cover all that in a moment. So this major figure passes away, and then there's a period of interruption. And Harriet Pattison was romantically involved with Louis Kahn. They had a child together. Louis Kahn was still married. So the prospect of her moving forward on that project stopped with Kahn's death, and it affected the project. I didn't know that at first, but I was in the archives. And this extraordinary moment of somebody building something 40 years after the principal designer died is madness, but they also did it. And that's amazing. It's incredibly remarkable. And Harriet wanted to see it built, but there were things that needed to be clarified. And anytime you build something so great distance in time, there's things that need to change, right? The American with Disabilities Act had been passed since, so a design from 1972-73 needed to be adjusted with that in mind. How do you do that when nobody involved in finalizing those designs was present at the time? So you have to read between the lines of the drawings. You come to an archive, right? People would do that with a piece of heritage, a site like this. In making decisions about managing change in the future, you would refer to a collection that includes oral histories and documents and papers to know the thing before you seek changing it out. With FDR, we did not have the benefit of that because it wasn't built. So it was kind of a radical sort of reconstruction. So working closely with Harriet was recognizing, oh my God, you are so integrally involved in this project. I did not know that. And to find and recognize her hand on drawings and see her hand in many of the drawings. And in fact, recognizing that she was the closest collaborator on this project. It's a project that Kahn described in essential terms, the garden and the room. And that balance between these two elements is important. So it got built. She got recognized as the principal landscape architect. Bill Clinton said that at the opening, which was pretty amazing. But it's recognizing that in her lifetime there was a period of negation where she was not part of the conversation, recognizing that she was and that she could tell stories and take me into that world, which was very helpful. Secondly was the book that was mentioned, Our Days Are Like Full Years, which I have to say started in 2009 and it wasn't published until 2021. So it took 10, 11 years to write. I got to be a part of that alongside her son, Nathaniel Kahn, the filmmaker, and really trying to weave together the story. But what was most important was to bring her story out. She didn't really want to tell it. She wanted to just publish Louis Kahn's letters, which were brilliant insights into his working relationship itself, but it left her mute in that. So to make sure that her story got out, I think was incredibly important. It's part of a larger question about how figures who are lost to history, how we restore them to history, how we kind of pull out and find new sources for information with respect to that. So it's a great feeling of pride that I have for seeing that book out. My name's not on it, and I don't want my name on it. I'm not trying to take any credit for it, but it was helpful in doing that. I also got to visit her island in Maine, which is one of the two sites I'm going to talk about alongside the Kimbell Art Museum. Okay? This is her at Four Freedoms Park. All right, so let me take you to Maine. And this is a view of the Indian Island, which is on the right at Beauchamp Point. So this is Rockport. And her mother, Harriet, bought this island from a government auction in about 1934 for about $700. There's a lighthouse on it, not a tree to be seen because it's a lighthouse. You don't want to block the light in that. And there's a series of rugged buildings. The tower of the lighthouse is 1840. The house is a little bit later. So this is coming to the island, and I'd say this is 2017. And you've got to go out there on a little boat, right? It could be a motorboat. I think Nathaniel Kahn was rowing us out in this point. And you can see the tide is lower. There's a rugged coastline, which at high tide that disappears. You see the kind of pebbly beach along the edge, these different layers that have to do with ecology and ecological systems and the forces that happen along the coast. You see a meadow, and then this wonderful grove of spruce trees on one side of the island, which is opposite the face to Penobscot Bay. This is a photograph of it in the 1950s when the family started to do some restoration. It's before plantings were really done. So, but it's really, in a sense, it's a blank canvas, but it's not. There's so much circumstance there, and the close reading of landscapes in making decisions about what to do next as a designer is present, and I'll show you that. The little boathouse disappeared long ago in some winter storm, or when the ice kind of, if the bay where Rockport is, if it gets iced in, that's when things break along the coastline. But you can see, I'm going to talk about, you can see that there's kind of a cut in the landscape there. So I'll come back to that. So arriving by motorboat, little motorboat, and then having to be rowed in the dinghy. And there's a little beach where one can land. Looking back at Rockport, and we happen to arrive at the end of the day, and just seeing the light quality and the changing light quality. So experiences in the landscape and how offering those up to people who are coming to your home, coming to your island, coming to an art museum, slows you down and changes your mood and your sensibilities. Buildings in the landscape and how they set in relation to the landscape. Here, a great example of American government architecture, very straightforward, stoutly built. No sense of ostentation to this besides a little bit of the flourish in the cast iron at the top of the lighthouse, which these images don't show you, but they are showing you the beauty of the light and the colors that are part of the main landscape. And then stepping up close to the house, just the light that is, glowing within. There's only a generator, it's not connected to the mainland. And so how in this austere circumstances, there's a sense of magnification. So this kind of reduction of and pulling out of essential qualities, this distillation is a quality that you see in Maine, and that Harriet was very much drawing into her sensibilities with respect to the landscape and then to her work as a designer. And then stepping out to, is this the front of the house? It's the face of the house that is addressing Penobscot Bay. This is where the heaviest wind would be coming to the house. And it's just a very straightforward facade. And then on the inside, just getting used to the darkness and a sense of the primitive state. I guess one could have updated these things, one could have done differently over the years, but she chose to keep it very focused in this essential way. Her mother died in 1969 and gave the house to Harriet and the island. And she had 6 other siblings. She was the youngest by far. She was the one who was always spoiled and indulged, and but she got the island. And every one of her siblings said, "You're crazy. You can't afford this. This isn't anything that you can manage yourself." And yet she's held on to it her whole life. And how could she give it away, right? There's so much to understand in understanding how to be a landscape architect that you could see here that she drew into her work. So part of the trip in 2022 is recognizing that she's an important figure in history, and that with every important figure in history, there are parts of their work and the work that they do that for some reason or another slips through the cracks. Often with designers, it's the houses and landscapes they do for themselves because they don't have to record and document it at the same level as work for a client. So case in point, Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, their own house, which is a 1908, 1910 house, which reminds me a lot of some of the early Mies houses that Barry was showing. The clients were German. They did a lot of just surface patterns and stenciling within the house. There's no drawings for it. There's no documentation for it. There's so little record with respect to it. Sometimes as a collections person, you have to go out and create a collection in the absence of one. When Debbie was mentioning Minerva Parker Nichols, one of the roles that we were playing in that project was she did 72 works that we could document. We went out and photographed every one that still stands. That was 32 works spanning from 1886 to 1938, sorry. Okay? So walking around her garden and walking around the island and recording notes from her about the nature of the landscape. And I'm showing you a page from my sketchbook. I have not taken it any further, where she and I are exploring the island. Her mobility was less at that point in time, but just kind of mapping where she had intervened, key ideas that were there in terms of managing this as a landscape well into the future, areas that she had started developing but maybe didn't finish, Abbott's Cove, named after her brother, and a desire to plant birch trees there, or poplars, not birch trees, yeah. And other places where she wanted to make sure that the sumac didn't come any farther up the hill. So these are putting down in paper and in a collection form some of the aspects that will be important in managing this into the future. So just to give you a little sense, because I want to walk you around the island and talk about things as we go around. So the kind of area where you're arriving on the island. And you can see there's the motorboat, and there's the dinghy. And the tides rise and fall about 7-8 feet in Rockport. So the edge of the island can be a very different experience in time. Moving down, and how you would progress from where you land on the island, a meadow, then through a path to the house and the lighthouse. And we see the house and the lighthouse and the barn. And then on the eastern side, facing Penobscot Bay, a very heavily rough landscape. Lots of granite and hard stone. The island also rises up. There's more of a lack of vegetation because that's the side that gets all the wind, and so tends to be on the other side of the island. So moving through that landscape, you can see where you land the boat and how you pull it up, the dinghy, because when the tides go up and down, if you don't pull the dinghy onto land, it'll float off. And then this path that has been cultivated with sumacs, some other trees on one side, and then mixing in with spruces. The spruces become more dominant. I'm not a landscape architect, so the tree question is, and being specifics with trees, a little bit more of a challenge, but you're seeing where spruces start to show in, and then you see where rocks and other elements start to focus you in on this wonderful little garden that she did in the mid-1970s. So you've kind of arrived on the island, you've had a chance to put things down, you get a breather with a sense of meadows, you're starting to focus people in on this garden path, moving you towards the house, and then you give a wonderful little circular garden. And here she is sitting in her garden, which one should say, all the materials are coming basically from the island. They had to bring a little bit of soil in, some seeds perhaps, but the paving and the paths come from the shore and just gathering rocks from the edge of the water, gathering stones to accent the garden that are already there and present, were probably gathered by the Coast Guard people who manned and maintained the station. There were also animals and cows and stuff in the 19th and early 20th century. And then just documenting the garden circle and the particular plants and the logic of its design. So 20-foot and circular, 2 entrances, its relationship to an old wall that was part of a paddock for the animals, and then particular trees in the relationship. But then moving on, and this is looking back down the path, there's kind of a dip down and there's a flat area where one can gather and have a seating area or a picnic. You've got the walkway and then up into a very dense area, and then turning around and facing the lighthouse where things start to get very darkened because of the nature of the spruce trees. And as you move out and get closer, the light changes on the ground, and then ultimately you see the high point is where the Coast Guard put the lighthouse. Makes complete sense. And it's only about 40 feet tall, maybe 50 feet tall. And if you go up on top, you get beautiful views of the landscape and to the sound. And then this is, after lunch, standing by where the kitchen sink and the stove is, looking out onto that landscape. So, giving you a sense of how one arrives and experiences the building. Okay. So let me just move you around the building, around the island in its totality. Stepping down out of the house, you see the lighthouse for the first time, and the rocks, turning yourself 90 degrees and seeing how rocks start to appear out of the landscape and then disappear with the tide. This kind of cleft in the rocks, which at high tide is completely inundated with seawater, and then stepping back further, and where this kind of receding and inundation happens throughout the day. Turning around 90 degrees, looking to Beauchamp Point and to Rockport, this rock edge, which becomes endlessly fascinating, where it starts to be the high tide line, and you start to pick up pebbles and rocks and little bits of detritus. And in the most recent trip in 2022, just starting to really look at that and recognize that the experience of the landscape, she's honed it a bit, but it's kind of setting you up to be curious about the world around and to pay attention to things. This will play into the Kimbell Art Museum in an important way. Finding little elements like this where you start to take notice, and this is just a still life that has been left in that moment. And I made a sketch of it. This is my sketch. But it's only to make the point of how particular experiences in architecture and landscape prepare you to do something and maybe see the world in a way that you were not understanding before or you were not expecting. And that heightened awareness, is the focus of people like Harriet Pattison and Louis Kahn, and their collaborations together become very important for that. So continuing to walk around the island, we've passed where the boats landed, and we have these little islands that float off, which she always called Pebble Beach. So the pebbles, the water moving in here, would create a beautiful, it would clean the pebbles up, and that's exactly what she would use in her garden circle. So using local materials, local plants and things were a value that she had in her work. You're moving around and we're passing Beauchamp Point. There's another little beach. This is Abbott's Cove, named after her brother, who was an artist and a sculptor. We can see the rising of the rocks, and you get this wonderful landscape of jagged edges. And this little element that she always called Pulpit Rock, and that's my wife standing at Pulpit Rock, where you're ready to give a sermon. What a beautiful place to hold court. And in this, examples of what Harriet described is, they set up and they did a performance of The Tempest, with all the kids around, and they kind of, so this way that you can use existing moments, improvise something, create a way of engaging not only with the landscape, but, creatively more broadly. And then coming around, and it's getting late, it's almost dinner time, the tide is rising again, and this very rocky shore coming around, but then releases. And as the tide comes in, the sounds change, and the sounds hitting in this cove shape and give you a sense of the changing landscape over the course of the day, following the tides and the in and outs of the tides, and just the way that you're able to perceive the changing weather in this kind of sense, this austere spareness of a landscape like this. And then just returning to the house, there's a way to sneak up from that cove through a more dense forest of trees, and then on to the house with the end of the day light. So leaving the house and going back, this is from the 2011 trip that we visited Harriet, and just motoring around the house, and there she is ready to wave goodbye to us. So let me give you a little bit of backstory on Harriet. So I've kind of taken you to a place that meant a lot to her. Let me see. So one point I want to make. So this shows my wife and I leaving Maine and leaving the island. And in a larger sense, hold on. Here is my wife and I leaving the island. And Maine, and in a larger sense, the island never left Harriet. There was always this experience that she carried through her entire life. And in going to her backstory, being born in Chicago in the Midwest, being raised in Chicago, in the city, going to the Parker School, every summer of her lifetime, and 20 years before, her family would drive all the way from Chicago to Rockport, to Lincolnville, to where they had a house called Faraway. And so they had the experience of Chicago and the winters along Lake Michigan, very different than the Maine coast and the sea. And then 2 months, July and August, maybe a little bit into September in Maine. So she had this through her entire life and upbringing. This is Faraway, the family house in Lincolnville. It's stolen the family and has been for about 125, 130 years. And then Harriet's first garden, which she did for her mother in the early 1950s, using local materials, local plants, maybe at a time before that was recognized. But more importantly, at the nearby town of Camden is a project that she is very tied to. It's the library garden in Camden. And this is Fletcher Steele. It was financed through a Philadelphian, Mary Curtis Bach, who, by the way, owned Beauchamp Point, so right near where Indian Island is. And it's an extraordinary landscape that steps down and connects the library space and provides a way out, and then to step into a different world, a world of performance, a different way of thinking about art, and that landscape is the connective tissue between those. Just a simple drawing from Fletcher Steele showing how the axis, so the line of movement, in other words, is turned. And of course it's turned and aligned with the harbor and to this landscape that is a part of the everyday lives of the community. So it's this wonderful way to take the library, the experience of the library, and connect it, in a sense, to the central aspect of the community that built it. And these wonderful pavilions on either side, which are then in turn flanked by Camperdown elms. And there's not a tree that Harriet liked more than a Camperdown elms, and I think there's a few around here if I'm not mistaken. So, but the sense of the theatric and being associated with theater and recognizing that the landscape can serve as stages is part of her education. I mentioned the Parker School. So, when the high school did plays, she's the ones who designed the sets for it. She went to school at Wellesley, but it was really at the University of Chicago where she finished her undergraduate degree, where she's really studying literature. And so, from writing and words is important. She goes to Yale and gets admitted to the Yale School of Drama. She's in Paul Newman's class. She was on stage with Paul Newman. I don't have a photo of it. He only lasted a year. She lasted 2. It was a master's degree. But instead of being put in set design, they put her into acting. So this is her playing a lead role. I'm not sure which play it is. So that she carries that with her into her working world, but kind of, doesn't settle herself down. She works in art galleries in New York at Park Burnett. She's not satisfied kind of with the path that she's taken. She's interested in architecture. She knows about Frank Lloyd Wright. She's interested in landscape, but she's not formalized that set of relationships, until she meets Louis Kahn. And through her connection to Louis Kahn, who she becomes romantically involved in, she's able to make the turn into design more definitively, working for Dan Kiley in another kind of distant landscape up on Lake Champlain, so away from the city, away from the urban environment, and then to come study landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania under the great ecologist Ian McHarg. And so people associate Ian McHarg with anything but gardens. with analysis, with understanding how to plan at the regional scale. These are all important lessons that landscape architects were coming to engage with and recognize. And yet there were still people teaching garden design, like Sir Peter Shepherd, the great horticulturist who was in charge of the Morris Arboretum at Penn, Dr. Fogg. And even Burle Marx, Roberto Burle Marx, the great Brazilian landscape architect, would be coming up to Penn. So while Ian McHarg recognized one direction and really embraced and built that out for the profession, and that's an important legacy, he also did not forget about questions of design. So Harriet's a part of that, but really was more associated with the gentler, traditions of landscape architecture. Okay. All right. So let me shift to Louis Kahn. So here's Louis Kahn standing with his client for the Kimbell Art Museum. This is Rick Brown. This is at the opening of the Kimbell Art Museum in 1972. For reasons that should be apparent to you, Harriet never traveled to the site. She didn't go to the opening, and she didn't get there until 10 years after the building opened because of her circumstances being involved with him romantically. So it's not a place where she had the direct experience of the Kimbell Art Museum. And I should say the Kimbell Art Museum is located in Fort Worth, Texas. It's one of the great Midwestern art museums. It's not giant in scale. It started off with a collection of about 70 works. It's got about 130, including the earliest known Michelangelo. The collection in its early form, there's only about 7 pieces that are still there from the initial collection from its opening. So they've traded up really nicely and honed an amazing collection. It's not a vast, expansive museum like the Met or the MFA in Boston or Philadelphia's Museum of Art. It's a big house, is the way that Kahn described it. And so a museum should be a big house. And so designing a landscape that speaks to that sensibility is important, or was a value that they discussed. And so Kahn, as an architect, he was born in Europe, born in what's now Estonia, comes to America as an immigrant in 1905, so he's young. He goes to Philadelphia public schools, but basically is living in the immigrant slums of Philadelphia. His family is one step ahead of the rent collectors for the better period of a decade. One of the things I found in investigating Kahn is his public school enrollment card, which showed that every 6 months for about 6 years they were moving. And we have every address. And I should point out, none of the buildings associated with those addresses still stand. So it gives you a sense of the kind of the poverty that he experienced early in life, and to the possibility that education gives you, along with talent and hard work, in making a life for yourself as an artist. He was first going to be a musician, but ultimately was drawn into architecture, and so went to the University of Pennsylvania and studied under great Beaux-Arts architects like Paul Kray, but came to modernism like so many of his generation that came of age in the 1920s and early 30s with the Depression, with modernism, doing housing, addressing the needs of the people, and carrying a sense of social conscience. He'll come back to sensibilities from the Beaux-Arts later in his work after a period of really understanding modernism. But I don't want to give you the big history of Kahn. I want to take you into the details of places like I did with the island. And that's what I tend to do in the archives, is immerse ourselves within a couple of objects and then reflect a bigger pattern that one can learn from that. So here's a sequence of drawings that Kahn made early in the design process for the Kimbell, where you see the gallery, you see the art, and you see the presence of nature. You see that in the way that he's rendered in white colored pencil and pink colored pencil this wonderful glow that's on the ceiling of the museum. And you'll see some photos of this in a moment. This is a concrete vault. It's a marvel of engineering and technology. It spans 100 feet. It's got cables in there that technologically make that all possible. And he makes it even more difficult by cutting a slit in the top of the vaults where the force is at their strongest, so that light could come in, and then through the intervention of a daylight fixture, a natural light fixture, reflects that up onto the ceiling. So that idea of where architecture helps focus the changing qualities of the day, where you see that movement of time, the receding and ebbing and flowing of the landscape around. And that you see here the presence within the plan, so within the volume of the building, of courtyards. And each of these courtyards, there's 3 in the final form. There was more earlier designs where you're looking into those spaces in different ways. Here, perhaps I would say this is springtime, and is this summer as things have matured. So suggested in this sequence of perspectives done for presentations to the client is that the landscape and the experience of changing qualities of natural light are essential to standing in front of a great work of architecture, or a great work of art, excuse me. And that the artists are relating to that and making the work in the first place. Let's bring that as a presence into the gallery space. And then there's a third drawing that's this one, and it's muddled. It's not as sharp as the other 2. I take this as a cloudy day. I take this when the light is disappeared or the light is changing in a way that its presence is less felt. And that this is part of the experience too, and that change in quality is important. So stepping to the outside, the relationship of trees in the foreground and how that's framing the experience of the building and how the building is going to be surrounded by landscape, but it's not worked out yet. And to be frank, the building is, in its early stages, there's about 6 different schemes. I don't have time to go through all of them. The first one, it's square in plan. It fills the entirety of the site. There is no room for any landscape around the building. Thank God for budgets, and thank God for people sticking to budgets, because it kept making the building smaller. And at some point, there was actually room to do something with the landscape. There was room for Harriet to be an active force in shaping this building this early on. And I'll just point out, you're entering at this, but look at this impossible wall. So you really don't have a way of extending out from the museum in a graceful way or in surrounding the building with spaces that could be activated as part of the landscape or could add different dimensions of experience around the landscape. So here's towards the end of the design development. The building, instead of being 100 foot, for each of the vaults, so this in its final form is about 310 feet across. These are the vaults are 150 feet. So it's actually closer to 500 feet. There's not really any room for anything except in this little corner. And this is one of Harriet's earliest drawings for the Kimbell. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but you see incorporated here a reflecting pool, but things have not been activated yet. Here we see where the landscape is starting to come into full clarity. And this is an attachment sent from Kahn to his clients. Kahn's not going to be able to be to the visit. He's not going to be able to be at the groundbreaking. So he writes a letter excusing himself for that, but basically laying out what the landscape program is for this project. And includes this drawing, which elaborates and goes with a text I'll read in a moment. So Harriet drew this and probably wrote principal parts of the landscape description I'll read in a moment. But we can see how the building is essentially U in shape. There's an area that's about 10, 12 feet lower than the height on that side. So there's a lower area that you can enter on this side. There's parking provided at this area. Trees encircle the building. Some are existing, some are added to. On each face will be a different species of oak. Here you get a stepped garden, which could be a theater space. So it could be activated in that way. There's existing rows of trees that then get focused in by a water element that's much more activated. So no longer is it just a reflecting pool with a sculpture in it. It's been activated in a way that Kahn described as kind of the odyssey of water. Okay? Yeah. Right, sorry, I split something there. Let me just read to you, and I had to put it as a slide so that I had a reference to it. So the site is surrounded by some busy streets, so you have to kind of focus in, but the garden is at a level 10 feet below the garden entrance. And so there's a gradual series of stepped lawns where one could watch performances or plays, and that the building's silhouette, its character in the landscape, in relationship to those spaces, might inspire certain uses and activities to occur. So the North Garden is a utility space, and that's where there's parking and loading and other elements. And there'd be shelter there. I'm sorry, it's too small for me to read. Let me go back to this, right? So, he's referring to this space over here. But, the West Lawn gives the building perspective, and the way that there's, recognizing the integral value with developing the landscape scheme with respect to the architecture to heighten the experience that they're looking for on the inside. So you can't really separate the landscape and the architecture. And here, just one of the site plans that Harriet Pattison did in relationship to this moment of design development. They're starting to understand this as a grove of interesting trees, but there's still a fountain space that links to that links to the theater court. I just wanted to point out here where you see the elements of structure that are part of the landscape. And then an important note that Harriet provided me is Kahn, when in making site plans, always asked for the trees to be included as elements, as structures, that were spatial in their character and maybe established certain rhythms with respect to the building and to your understanding therein. Okay, let me skip ahead. So the developed construction drawing, which comes out of the collection, this is the planting plan, comes out of the collection of George Patton. So it should be said that Harriet Pattison is working for George Patton. She's the principal landscape architect working on this because of her close connection to Louis Kahn and working very closely with him. And so this gives us the plants and the details of the plants, the parking areas down here, the theater court, the forecourt with its interesting trees, the ways that oaks surround and the different kind of oaks that are included in and around. All right, moving forward. So let me move you around the building. So in each of the different faces, this is on Camp Bowie, which is the main street. These are live oaks, but there's scarlet and white oaks on other sides. And then in a corner, a prominent corner, you get water oaks and rudbud trees. This is the West Lawn that gives the building its perspective. So you have a place for picnicking, for activities that are separate, but those trees that run across are an existing LA from an earlier state fair that kind of helped shape the experience. But your focus comes down to the water element, which is very distinctive. We'll come back to that in a moment. Stepping off to the west and looking at the long view of the building and really wanting to approach the building from this upper level and the sequence of pathways and raised and lowered areas and how there's no walls or parapets that are blocking your way. He's using the technique of the ha-ha from the English landscape tradition to create a break in the landscape without breaking it visually. It's also wonderful seating areas if you're thinking about a theater court. In this crepe myrtle court, which is related to the theater court, you get these very thin, spindly trees on a 10-foot square planting plan that then provide a view, and you get the silhouette of the building. This is a photograph by Charles Birnbaum from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, who did a really important project documenting Harriet's work through an oral history online that is really a great resource. But just the activity that can occur in a landscape like that and then can add and extend what happens in terms of the experience of art and sculpture on the inside, but then embracing other arts. It's never really been fulfilled in its possibility, but it's something that Harriet always spoke about as being an important part of the conversation. It wound up becoming the site of a permanent landscape, permanent installation of work by Izumo Noguchi. Stepping back up, one of the wonderful elements are these porticos, and Kahn spoke about them being wonderful in a sense because they're not necessary. They don't have to be there, and yet they give you a space that you're stepping under. You're not yet in the building, but you're getting closer. You have these wonderful activated water edges in terms of their fountain that make wonderful sounds. It captures, and focuses your attention despite the fact that there's cars all around. And that sound really dominates. And with the wind, you hear different, it really makes it quite magical. And then the kind of drawings that Pattison would have been doing, where you're getting the technical details, the different elevations, and then Kahn annotating on top of that in conversation about how to deal with an edge, and just deciding that that rear edge, needs to be this thick, big piece of stone rather than veneer. It needed to have a sense of mass and character. Stepping under those porticos, moving through that space, you have the sound of the water. You're within the architecture. There's a slit up on one side, so you get a balanced light. There's benches. There's an edge where water can lap if it's windy, and you can step down, and you're getting very close to elements of nature. And then you're also getting close to this, forecourt, which it's defined by landscape. It's defined by these wonderful trees, which were initially spec'd to be hornbeam trees. And hornbeams you can plant very densely, but they're no good for Texas. Texas is too hot. So working with a local arborist and landscape gardener in Texas, it was identified, well, there's this great tree called Yupon holly. So the Yupon hollies have been this is the older version of Yupon hollies. They were replanted. They last about 40 years, so they had to be replanted when the Renzo Piano building was done. And then stepping closer into the building, how in its gaps between the different elements, it's revealing its structure, it's revealing how the building is put together, the relationship of one part to another. It's also creating room for light and, by extension, nature. There's symmetries present within the building, but there's diagonals that are occurring throughout how one moves through the building. And then on the inside, you guys finally get a sense of this quality of changing light that comes on the vaults. This is a concrete building, and a lot of people associate raw concrete with brutalism or with tough, bloody-minded architecture. But this is actually incredibly graceful. It's incredibly light in its character. The surface of the concrete could not be more smooth and polished in its character. And then there are wonderful inside courtyards featuring works of art, this sculpture by Mayol, and it's right next to where you might go have your lunch. But stepping outside of the building and reflecting on that kind of changing quality of architecture and bringing you to two sites that Harriet lived with and worked closely with, that sense of awe that can come in certain moments where you become aware of something bigger than yourself, where choosing through choices that designers make and in making the palette spare, you create the possibility that you can have a heightened awareness for people. So moving into the Kimbell Art Museum would not be such, the experience of being in the Kimbell Art Museum and seeing art in the Kimbell would not be as powerful if the landscape quality was not as carefully integrated into it. The way you walk in, the sounds, the changing light quality are all things that prepare you for the experience of art and make the building incredibly strong. So here's Harriet in her garden, back on Indian Island, in that garden circle she did in the 1970s. And I think she's literally saying, is this not wonderful? Every time she comes back and would come back to the island, she went there every summer until 2022. And just this incredible connection you can have in the world. Why should our landscapes and our gardens that we have in our buildings and we live with in daily life not bring that out for us? So thank you. I'm not sure I covered modernism, but hopefully I gave you a sense of what makes architecture and landscape architecture in its best sense inseparable.